So I want to welcome Kiran Khalid, who is the former producer for CNN and ABC News, Good Morning America, and also Ash-Har, who is a national correspondent for Al Jazeera America. And today we're going to talk about how journalists fared in this week's coverage following the shootings in San Bernardino, California. So welcome both of you.
Thanks
I
for
want to I want to start off first by talking about what journalists and what news organizations got right this week. Who did a good job covering this shooting, and how did they cover it? And I'll start with you, Karen.
Okay, so there's definitely a lot of criticism about how things were covered, but I was pleasantly surprised that Stephanie Goss at NBC Nightly News actually went to one of the mosques frequented by the shooter and interviewed the assistant imam as well as other peers, people in the same age group, who gave their side in terms of it not being a radical mosque, and that nothing like that had taken place there. There was no incendiary rhetoric, and that was very that was helpful, because that was an example of providing context and nuanced reporting, which I think was absent from everyone else's coverage.
So tell me, unfortunately, I didn't see NBC's coverage. I did see their sister network coverage. What exactly did she ask? What kind of was it the kinds of questions she asked that made it good coverage, or the fact that she stepped out of and did something different from what everybody else was doing?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a relevant story. I think it was even, more than just a sidebar. Everybody else was doing TikToks of what had happened, and then, the gun debate. But what she did was, the questions that she asked weren't they didn't put the subjects on the defensive. She was really making an effort just to learn more about their perspective, how they felt, having known this guy, having seen his wife come to the mosque. And then she went as far as talking to them about fear that they have in their community about the backlash and just growing Islamophobia, and included a voicemail message that they had received, that they transcribed and showed on the air exactly the kind of hatred that a lot of Muslim centers of worship are contending with right now.
Ashar, would you agree with Karen about how NBC pursued the story, and do you have any other examples?
Well, I can't say that there was one particular outlet that I thought did a really, really good job. Everybody had good and bad moments, obviously, and as Kiran pointed out, the approach that NBC took in that particular case was one of those better moments. Obviously, their sister network MSNBC had some more 24-hour cable news type hiccups with some of the approaches they took to covering the story, and a lot of outlets did. But I think the problem that I saw across the board with the coverage was the lack of nuance. And it was very sort of obviously it's very competitive, but I think that in the effort to be competitive, a lot of news agencies, news channels, print and online as well, sort of just went at it full force without really being measured or thoughtful about the coverage. And I think that was a disservice to not only the viewers, and continues to be a disservice. And it sort of reminded me of what happened, immediately post 9/11, where, the media went into this sort of automatic patriotic mode where they didn't ask the tough questions. And I still feel like, most news organizations over the course of the week didn't ask the tough questions. They've been using information from unnamed sources, and that's been regurgitated over and over again and entered the echo chamber. And you don't really know what the source of this information is, in the end. And a lot of it is coming from law enforcement. And you have to also question the fact that, well, if all of your information is coming from law enforcement, and that's your only sort of way to form this narrative, you have to also question, well, what is that narrative? And if you think about it, one of the big things that struck me was the fact that, FBI Director Comey said recently in the last few months that they have 900 active ISIL investigations across the U.S., that there are ISIL investigations in all 50 states. And that struck me because, that suggests that they have a pretty decent handle on a lot of cases, and this one completely caught them by surprise. So, the idea that, that there was a law enforcement failure here has not been addressed, I don't think, to the extent that it should have been. And that all the information we're getting right now is coming from law enforcement. And this is basically, a lot of CYA.
I agree. There have not been any questions about why this failure happened. Let me ask you. How did Al Jazeera cover this story? And did they do as well as they could have?
Well, I mean, we're still, I think, a new kid on the block, and I think we did pretty well. I think we were very thoughtful. From the internal editorial guidance that I saw, nothing was taken for granted. Everything was questioned. Everything was verified that they put on the air. They were very thoughtful about the editorial sort of decisions they were making when it came to, for example, that the press running into the apartment complex after the landlord let in a couple of news outlets and everybody rummaging through that material. And there were discussions about whether or not it was appropriate. We weren't in there. I mean, Al Jazeera wasn't in there, but there were discussions about how appropriate it would be to air any of the content that was found inside that apartment. And that's very different from what happened on CNN and MSNBC, for example, or Inside Edition. CNN was live inside of the apartment complex. It's kind of like, what we saw with, the advent of police car chases. How long are you going to follow this chase until somebody gets out and pulls a gun out and puts it to their head? And then you're going to pull away, you're going to cut away then? That is, I think, a major failure that we've seen. And we've seen these networks try and defend their decision to go into these areas and show this material unvetted, without any real editorial thought going into what they should and should not show. And some of them having to backtrack. MSNBC, for example, apologizing for showing sensitive photographs of young children, identification that didn't relate to the suspects. But the damage is already done, and I think that that's something that was a huge failure, and they have to acknowledge it. And I think that's something that moving forward, other news outlets have to acknowledge. I mean, it looked like I've never seen anything like that in my life. I was in shock watching this, and it was sort of one of the darkest things you can imagine coming out of journalism is the way that this was approached.
Kiran,
sorry, Tracie. I just wanted to piggyback on some of the points that Ash-Har had made. So both of us have had experience at CNN. Ash-Har was actually the bureau chief for CNN in Pakistan, based in Islamabad, and I know that he'll probably agree with me that S&P, Standards and Practices, was very robust, and it was something that we constantly contended with. I think we even complained about how nitpicky they could be. And what strikes me about this is not only did that conversation not take place, obviously, and the instinct to go live, didn't seem to have any forethought, but when the shooter was being identified as being Muslim and his name was being told, and a lot of news outlets, including the LA Times, went with that information with unnamed sources, and CNN held back until they had at least one named source who could verify that information. And I know this speaking to colleagues, because I reached out to them and I said, please tell me they're not Muslim. And they said, we have that information. We don't have it confirmed, but it looks like workplace violence because he knew the people and he worked there. So at least there was a blended motive. And so to hold back in that scenario, the way that we did with the Michael Jackson's death, I was in the newsroom that day, and we were one of the last to report it, but many people say they didn't believe it until they saw it on CNN. And that's a testament to the brand's association with trust, right? And I feel like what happened in terms of going into that house and going live has eroded that trust further. And that's a problem.
First of all, why don't we explain to people what standards and practices at CNN is? What exactly is that?
Do you want to take that, Usher?
So, there are certain rules. It's basically your ethical guide, your journalistic guide, and each media organization should have a standards and practices, manual essentially, and they have people who work in standards and practices. And when there are tough editorial questions that go beyond just the editorial, but also might sort of bleed into the legal, there are a team of people who have these discussions before they happen. And having a robust team that does that is so important, particularly in these kinds of situations where you don't want to be first and wrong. And the point is that you think about these things and you take a step back and you take a breath and you say, do we want to be first and wrong, or would you want to be last and right? And CNN, while I was there, had a very, very robust system, as Kiran mentioned. That was number one. We never wanted to be wrong. And I feel like, in today's world of 24-hour cable news, it's much more acceptable to be first and wrong than it is to be, last and right. And that's one of those things that I've seen as a problem, and it's one of the reasons I actually came over to Al Jazeera America, was because they have that sense of pride in taking things from an ethical standpoint and editorially vetting things to a degree that doesn't seem to be taking place at other news outlets as much as it used to be.
So standards and practices requires the journalists at CNN and other organizations to vet the information that they receive before they air or publish it. But journalists also have the Code of Ethics. The Society of Professional Journalists has one. The Radio and Television News Media Association has one. And what that standard says, what that guide says, is that journalists should first do no harm. And so what we've talked about in the last couple of minutes is that harm was done this week with our coverage, and it hurt our credibility and also hurt the way that our trust with viewers. And so I want to talk a little bit about that do no harm code in our code of ethics. What were the specific harms done, do you think, with the CNN coverage and MSNBC coverage that you cited as lacking nuance? What were some of the, not only did it lack nuance, but there were harms done? What were some of those?
Well, one of the first things that struck me was, what is the relevance? Obviously, there are two things you have to ask yourself. By going into this apartment and shooting all these personal items that, the landlord actually had no right to give them access to. Next of kin has rights to that property. And so I don't care what CNN's reporter who went live inside there says after the fact, just because the landlord let her in doesn't mean that she had a right to be there. And, the idea that we can, as journalists, we obviously have to investigate vigorously, but, it goes along with, it may not be illegal, and in some cases it may be illegal. You have to ask yourself, is it right? Is it ethically, morally correct as a journalist to do things where you exploit or you circumvent the law, you circumvent standards and practices of your own organization to get ahead of the competition? And I think those questions were not asked. And, you saw things that sort of were mind-boggling. People went in there with cameras and pointed their cameras at, the Quran or, an Arabic rug on the wall, which are, if you walked into any Muslim household in the United States, you're going to find those things. There was nothing, that should have jumped out about the fact that this Muslim family had, an Arabic reader or, a Quran in the house. It's like saying that, you go into the Planned Parenthood shooter's apartment and you find a Holy Bible. You're saying, oh, okay, that's evidence that he's obviously an extremist. It's not. And I think that it was sensationalizing the nature of who these people were beyond what we actually knew as fact. Because you could walk into any Muslim household in the United States and find all of those same things. The ammunition, all those other things, that's a different story. But by focusing on those things, you create xenophobia and you ascribe what is a common, normal thing amongst Muslim Americans to an extremist who, is alleged to have, carried out this attack, and you're conflating the two. And I think that that was a major problem that I saw with it, was that there was no context whatsoever.
I feel like, I understand the inclination to go in the house. I mean, I think it speaks to the pack mentality that you often have with a huge story like this. Everybody else is doing it. Why weren't you in there? So I understand the pressure. And also, this was unprecedented. Never before have you been able to go into the home of an accused terrorist and see how they lived. But Usher's right. Like, there was nothing revealed there that was surprising. For instance, showing the baby's crib. We all know there was a 6-month-old baby involved in terms of, they had a child. And we know that they were Muslim. We knew that they were very devout Muslims and at some point were radicalized. So the thing was that there was no win there, right? It was just sensational to go in. And I can even understand if you didn't realize that you were legally trespassing, right? That was breaking the law. Let's just say you didn't even know that. Why wouldn't you take the video, bring it back, and then have a conversation with standards and practices? What was the urgency to deliver that information?
Exactly. Or go live immediately.
Right. And I think that MSNBC was the worst, because Andrea Mitchell, who was, it's Andrea Mitchell, right, who was anchoring that day. So she was even uncomfortable with what was happening and cautioned Kerry Sanders, the correspondent, to not show photos. But his inclination to hold up the Social Security card on live television, to show the mother's driver's license, and I've actually heard, people who see no problem with that. In fact, ironically, they're Muslim, and they said, you know what, that mother-in-law must have known something. And so if this is a consequence of her involvement, then so be it. But the counter argument, while it's obvious, there's also a crime scene. I mean, granted, they claim they had closed the crime scene, but how do you know that somebody didn't want to go back? And now it's completely tainted. So if anything, there's a possibility that these people, the families will not be accused if they were involved, if they were implicated somehow, because you have a tainted crime scene.
Well, and literally, while it was happening, CNN's own analyst was in shock. He said law enforcement should be there immediately and sealing that location off. The FBI may have cleared it, but now they can never go back if they needed to gather more evidence or information without it being tainted or questioned or inadmissible in court. And, back to Karen's point, is within 48 hours, they gleaned everything that they needed to. I mean, we still don't know anything, it seems like. The FBI says, has been saying that this doesn't make sense. We don't know. We don't have all the facts. And yet they cleared the scene in 48 hours, and dozens of journalists have now trampled through that area, and it's essentially rendered useless if you think about it from the standpoint of an investigator. We don't know what's missing. I know, they obviously seized material, and so if they didn't seize the material, the other question is, well, what could you glean from what was left in there anyway? It was deemed irrelevant by the investigators, which is why it was left behind. So why go in there other than for the prurient, voyeuristic nature of getting eyeballs?
I agree. Ash-Har, a minute ago you mentioned morality. What moral obligations do journalists have? Do journalists have moral obligations?
I think absolutely.
How we cover?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, it's a very competitive field. Of course, we have to be, we have to investigate vigorously, and we have to keep things in perspective. And you have to ask yourself certain questions. Before you're a journalist, you're a human being. And, I know lots of journalists who have had this become an issue for them, is, when you're talking about victims of violent crimes, how soon is too soon to go knock on their door to ask them how do they feel about losing a loved one? And that goes beyond a journalistic moral question. That goes to a human moral question, is, think about those things before you do them. And if you don't, then you suffer the consequences of what happens to journalists who literally go off the reservation and have no more compass. And eventually that catches up with you.
Karen, we talked earlier about an image that the New York Post ran. Can you talk a little bit about that image, Muslim killers image? And I'll try to bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hold that publication to a high standard. I mean, they're the ones who had a headline that said "Good riddance" when Arafat died. So it's clear what their leanings are. But that headline was incendiary and very irresponsible, fanning the flames of Islamophobia, which is already growing in this country. And even other outlets, their competitors even call them out for it. So I feel like the consequences of that are huge. I don't think that it was just a headline that appeared that was in poor taste. I think it contributed to a growing fear and hatred of Muslims in America.
I'll agree with that. I mean, you know, what, 353 mass shootings in the past year. Maybe 2 of them involved Muslims, including this one. And how many times were the killers' religious affiliations used as the precursor to them being killers? I would love to see what the New York Post has done on that in the past. But this was clearly another xenophobic headline that was meant to link this incident with this religion and not with the individuals, and to put upon a collective guilt across the Muslim community, the American Muslim community at least, rather than the individuals who were involved in this particular incident.
Yeah, again, absence of any context there, right? Just a knee-jerk reaction. And you know, I think it's really interesting that in journalism ethics, we look at all of these things, we evaluate headlines, and it just seems like in the rush to judgment here, there was none of that in any medium, be it print or broadcast.
I'm going to put this question to the both of you before we go into our third phase. Let me ask. I'm going to just be blunt. Have our ethics changed in recent years? In this digital era, have our ethics changed at all?
Well, I think Usher and I are kind of old school,
Yeah.
and you know, we came up when media law and ethics was the cornerstone of your training as a journalist. And so, since you know you've had the advent of backpack journalism and all sorts of online sites purporting to be journalists, there's an absence of that training. And also, you know, at CNN in particular, they went through a huge purging of senior management, and a lot of veteran journalists who had that wisdom, who could weigh in on these difficult decisions, are no longer there. And frankly, I don't know how much emphasis is being placed on media law and ethics. I mean, we had to learn case law about it, applied it, you know, early on in our career. I don't know if that exists now. You know, I'm not privy to that.
I would love to hear what Ted Turner has to say about this. I mean, you know, you look at, unfortunately, what's happened to our former network, and you see you see a double standard. I mean, the fact of the matter is that when it comes to issues or stories involving Muslims, there is a double standard. It is much easier. You can get away with saying a lot more about a Muslim suspect than you can about anybody else. You know, the fact that CNN had a double standard when it came to the way they dealt with journalists like Elise Labott, who tweeted out, you know, a reaction to the idea that you know, Congress wasn't going to wasn't going to allow these Syrian refugees in, and that she editorialized, and she was suspended for 2 weeks. If the same thing were done, you know, and has been done, I mean, in the case of John Voss and Aisha Sese, who asked a Muslim activist in Paris after the Paris attacks, why he didn't know that these attacks were going to happen, you know, that he should bear some collective blame for not knowing what a radical in the midst of Paris was doing just because he shared the same religion as them is shocking to me. Absolutely no repercussions for that line of questioning. And I think that is much more acceptable. When you hear some of the things that people say to and about Muslims, if they were said about any other group, they would be completely unacceptable, worthy of suspension, if not dismissal, by legitimate news organizations. And they're not. It's accepted. It is acceptable.
So we're not.
It's like the 1940s, 1930s. Anti-Semitism, was rampant at that time, and it was okay to say those things. It was acceptable, as it was, for the last, 100, 200 years about African Americans in this country. If you look at what was said about African Americans in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and you said that today, it would be completely unacceptable. But currently, that is the same tone that is allowed to be used against Muslims when it comes to the context of the news. So yes, I think there are different ethical standards when it comes to who we're talking about.
And to quote John Valls, the word responsibility comes to mind.
Yeah.
Are we holding each other? Good lead-in. Are we holding each other responsible for this kind of behavior, for this kind of lack of professional standards among our fellow journalists?
I would at least say this, is that the outcry, just on my Facebook feed, I saw comments from journalists who were appalled by what happened this week and what happened, in that apartment. Just a dark day for journalism. So yes, there are people who are calling this out. SBJ put out a statement about it. It's very important that we police ourselves. And at some point you have to identify who the responsible news media outlets are and who the ones that are not responsible are. And I think that, at least there was sort of a stunned outrage of what happened amongst the journalist ranks. And there was a little bit of, tail between the legs on the part of MSNBC. I didn't see the same thing at CNN. I feel like they feel a little bit more like, they did nothing wrong in this case. But at least there was an outcry, and average people who know right from wrong know what happened in there was unethical.
Right. Yeah, I concur completely.
Kiran, okay, so in our last couple of minutes here, I want to look forward and talk about ways that we can improve the way we cover Muslim communities. Period. And so maybe the two of you can weigh in on that.
I just wanted to add something as part of that discussion about the ethics, because this is something that I've seen throughout breaking news in the last 5 to 10 years. When we were coming up as journalists, our generation, it was completely wrong to speculate on the air. You only went with facts, you double source, and you didn't speculate. And everyone is doing that, from the anchors to the correspondents. And I understand that they're live, and one of the things that I enjoyed about live reporting, and also just the immediacy of broadcast news, the reason I was drawn to it, is because you have the opportunity to disseminate information, process it immediately, and give it to the viewer. There's an adrenaline rush to that when you're live at a breaking news story. But with that came the responsibility to only go with the facts that you knew, and not speculate about motives, people involved, and that sort of thing. Whether there's pot in the air and it's, in Baltimore and whatnot, you would never do that.
100%, I agree with Kiran there, is that we have gotten away from the idea that what comes out of your mouth should be confirmed. That was one of my biggest problems with the way 24-hour cable news has sort of evolved in the last 10 or 11 years, I think, is that, you can have people pontificating and talking about things that they have no idea whether or not they're true or not, but they will go down that road to say, what if this is true? Oh, this could be true, or that could be true, or this might point to that, or this might point to that. And they're filling time with essentially nonsensical, opinionated rubbish. It is not news. It is not factual. And that is something that I think has changed dramatically and has been allowed, shockingly, across the board, it seems. The idea that the things that come out of some people's mouths today on the air, or that you'll put on a guest who will just speculate about something without actually having any factual information about it, just to fill time and to have a discussion, is irresponsible. And I think that this move away from, well-vetted, reported, packaged stories, at least in broadcast, to talking heads that are spouting off anything that comes off the top of their head without any actual knowledge or, is amazing to me, and it does a disservice to the audience at large because they think they know something and they don't. All they know is the opinions of these 4 people who have been put up in boxes on a cable news channel without any information, essentially, and it just starts to feed itself. And then the regurgitation, the echo chamber continues, and one person said, well, I heard it on CNN, or I heard it on MSNBC, or I heard it over here, and they just keep regurgitating it, and it just starts feeding itself and becomes a snowball, and nobody knows what the source of the information was in the first place.
I think it's important to underscore the point that it's not just pundits making these kind of incendiary statements. They're actually journalists making these statements. During this week's coverage of the shooting, I heard a public radio journalist, a reporter, talking about the shootout as it was happening between police and the suspects. And the public radio reporter said, "This feels like it should we're in Syria, someplace like Syria, not in the United States." That is editorializing, and that is wholly inconsistent with public radio's ethical standards, I believe. But yet we heard it.
And I think one of the reasons why people assume that the 24-hour cable news networks have these talking heads ad nauseum is because they're feeding the beast, right? And it's just a demand for content. But the irony is there are a lot of good stories that never make it into the newscasts that would expand their coverage, which international reporting, there are correspondents who break their neck to get a story done, and then it never sees the light of day on these domestic networks, and it's a disservice to the audience. And a lot of people who watch these channels or who are forced to in the airport have noted that the news is repetitive. They're running the same thing over and over again. So if you have that wide of a platform and you have that amount of time, then why aren't you diversifying what you're covering?
And Tracie, back to your original question about how we should be covering the Muslim community moving forward, it's how you should cover any community, which is not in 2 dimensions. You have to go beyond the narrative that you believe. If you go into a story and you think you know what the story is before you've even started reporting it, you've failed. And I think that's the #1 problem we have today, is that the narrative is so oversimplified. There's no nuance to the coverage, that these people that you're reporting on are 2-dimensional. If you're talking about a Muslim who's involved in a criminal act, the first thought obviously is terrorism, international terrorism. Are they related to Al-Qaeda? Are they related to ISIS? Are they inspired by ISIL? Were they radicalized online? It couldn't be anything else, right? It couldn't be that they got fired from work and they were disgruntled, or it couldn't be that they have mental issues, or it couldn't be anything else. The automatic sort of nature of fitting people into these boxes is what is a disservice. You miss everything on the periphery. It's the same thing that's been said, in Chicago, where I am based, and what we cover on a daily basis is the gun violence in the city, and the idea that the former superintendent or whoever the head of the police department is at the time can come out and say a shooting was gang related. Every shooting is not gang related. They may want you to think that, but that's not necessarily the case. But it's an easy narrative to make everybody feel safe about something that they can't understand, or something they can't wrap their heads around. And I think that lack of nuance is something that happens when you cover all communities of color, the Muslim community, the African American community, the poor community. Those issues are deeper than just black and white. There's a lot of gray in there. There's a lot of nuance in there. And until we stop looking at people as 2-dimensional characters that fit a certain narrative that has been perpetuated and regurgitated over and over and over again, we're going to have these divisions, because we're not going to try and understand people and where they come from and what motivates them.
I think if they would exercise the same level of skepticism they do when they have on a Muslim guest, if they did that with everyone, then they would be living up to their responsibility as a journalist, because journalists by nature should have a healthy dose of skepticism. I mean, we don't participate in the checks and balances system if we're not pushing back, if we're not challenging these narratives and asking for proof. I mean, we've seen reporters try to do it with Donald Trump, and they've been shut down immediately, and they've allowed themselves to move on to the next question. But, these narratives do need to be challenged, and specifically in this country, there's been a narrative that just sticks, which is that, there's all these sleeper cells and something is brewing, and every time you have a lone, a lone attack like this, a lone wolf attack, that it feeds that narrative that this gathering storm is imminent, even if they're not indicative of a cell. And a lot of the cases I covered the court in New York, the district court there and federal court, where they had people accused of terrorism, and I can tell you that in a lot of cases it was very flimsy evidence, but because of the latitude that the Justice Department has in the Patriot Act, they were able to bring these charges and make them stick. I covered a terrorist whose mom allowed me into their home, and her point was, my son isn't intelligent enough to participate in this. I mean, he has mental deficiencies, and as an example, she showed me his bedroom where he had a Beanie Baby collection. Like, it didn't fit the narrative that he would go to Syria or Cairo and get radicalized. And I don't think enough people, and meanwhile, law enforcement was chalking it up as a win and more evidence of how their vigilance was paying off.
And to that point, I think we have to do a better job collectively of holding law enforcement officials responsible. I mean, if you just look at what happened here in Chicago in the last few weeks with the Laquan McDonald case, that was an issue where the media essentially tried, and some tried very, very hard to get answers on that case and didn't get those answers, and others just sort of let it go and went with the official narrative. And the questioning of the official narrative is something that has to continue to happen. And I feel like, on big stories like this, people are, afraid to ask questions that would put into question what the official narrative is and question the motivations behind the release of information, the leak of information, how things unfold, and the utilization of the media to project a narrative that, in the end, you have to question, who stands to gain from this narrative, and what part do they play in helping to, push and project that narrative forward. And so I think that holding people responsible beyond just what you're told and verifying information and going back and questioning officials about the official, narrative is so important and lacking. I mean, I spent months in Ferguson, last year, and we had a situation where a SWAT team tear gassed us away from protesters when we were, not around anybody else, and the official narrative was that they came and rescued us. And they didn't. They were the reason we needed rescuing. But their official narrative, their official reports falsified what happened. And when that happens, you have to say, as journalists, we have to hold these people responsible, and we have to hold their feet to the fire, and we have to question everything that they are saying to us and vet it thoroughly. You can't just take it at face value, unfortunately. Every story is an investigative story in that sense.
And when it comes to covering the Muslim community in particular, there's this narrative that's being perpetuated repeatedly, which is, these people are radicalized in mosques. And I've covered domestic terrorism, for some time when I was at CNN, and I've spoken to people who had informants in their midst and were frustrated because they thought they had a partnership with law enforcement. And they didn't understand the justification for spying on them. And I think a lot of the public in general feels that, people know this because people should know if someone's being radicalized in their midst at their place of worship. And the fact is this radicalization is happening online. It's not happening in the mosque. It's not visible to someone, what's going on with someone else in their head, what they're doing with their spare time, who they're connecting with online. That's where this is happening.
So I appreciate the both of you for having this conversation today. I think it's really important because at this time when journalists, our sole job is to hold officials and authority accountable. If we don't do that, then there's really no purpose for us to be even included in the U.S. Constitution. It's the only profession that's specified in the Constitution. So I want to thank you both. Excuse me. And I hope we can, next time we get together, we can talk about all the great things that happen as a result of the work we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracie.